Okay, well, thank you everyone for tuning in and welcome to CTO Talk. I am your host, Matt Ferrari. On this 30-minute program, we get to discuss the issues, the opportunities that are really impacting healthcare technology. You can always follow the show on Twitter at #CTO Talk or follow me at MP Ferrari on Twitter. With me today, I'm really fortunate to have Conor Colgan, Will Carlson, and Adam Greenfield. And typically we only have one or two guests, but today we're talking really interestingly about Kubernetes and some of the use cases for Kubernetes in healthcare. And Will is the product manager for ClearDATA's Google platform, Conor, the product manager for the AWS platform, and Adam, the VP of architecture. So really excited to have each of them with us. And so welcome to the show. Adam, I'd love to kind of start with you and really set the stage. So would you mind walking through with the audience some background on Kubernetes?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Kubernetes originated with some work inside of the Google organization. So Google's been a thought leader in the container space in general for a long time. Many of the folks that have been around technology for a while will remember that Google introduced a lot of the primitives that have driven container technology forward into the Linux ecosystem initially, and they've certainly continued to be leaders within the Kubernetes project. But based off of a similar theme to much of the tooling that they had internally at the time, they thought that there was certainly a larger need in the broader technology space to have an open source based container orchestrator. And the idea of Kubernetes in that way wasn't entirely without precedent at that point. There were other container orchestrators that continue to be used in the space. Some of the earliest ones were Mesos and Marathon from the Apache ecosystem. And there have been a number of different ones throughout the ages, but Kubernetes really seems to have gotten a centricity or sort of groundswell of support around it. And there's a lot of large organizations that are committing significant engineering effort to making Kubernetes an enterprise-grade platform for people to build on top of. So I think a lot of it starts back in those early Google days from wanting their developers to focus primarily on writing applications. And I think in the enterprise, people are really starting to see that value proposition resonate for them as well. So that's really, I think, where Kubernetes came from.
You know, Adam, you mentioned Marathon and Mesos. Where do you think the tipping point was? You know, why or when do you think that enterprise organizations started, to consider Kubernetes as being kind of the winner in the space?
That's an interesting question. I think that it really got to the point where so many different large organizations were investing in the Kubernetes ecosystem that it felt like it had that momentum. But container orchestration has been a topic for a long time. The general idea being that as we have these increasingly complex IT systems, we need to build better tooling and systems to help us manage our workload. Kubernetes really came into the space and introduced a paradigm where developers could express the dependencies of their application in a fairly straightforward text-based format, and there was a lot of good community-supported and enterprise tooling to take it from that basic definition of infrastructure to an actually running orchestrated application. And that removed a lot of complexity where developers or operators really had to coordinate closely to be able to ensure applications were being deployed appropriately in production environments or promoted through the lifecycle from dev to QA to production, as the case may have been. I really think that amount of interest and the tool chain sort of developer experience have really been the driving factors that have driven Kubernetes to be as successful as it has been.
Excellent. That's extremely helpful. Thinking about now taking what we know about Kubernetes already in this discussion, I'm curious, Will, would you kind of walk me through, what you're seeing in healthcare and why you're seeing that tipping point for Kubernetes in healthcare now?
I see a few reasons for that. Healthcare is really picking up momentum towards developing new solutions quickly. And a great tool to be able to do that is Kubernetes, right? Containerized workloads. They need to have developers easily create new concepts, new proofs of concepts on production with PHI workloads and develop rapidly against that. There's another reason they need to sort of move towards this direction is they need to be able to attract new talent. For too long, healthcare has sort of been a stick in the mud. I think the old saying is they've been 7 years behind technology-wise. So attracting new talent to develop these sort of cutting-edge applications is sort of a new approach
Excellent. And, there's lots of different, distributions and platforms that are running Kubernetes. There's EKS and AKS and GKE, EKS, of course, being Amazon, AKS being Microsoft Azure, and GKE being Google. Conor, with your deep AWS background, would you mind kind of walking the audience through what you see, in the EKS world, whether it's, differences in the platform or advantages for using a platform like EKS?
Yeah, the customers that I've been talking to that are interested in EKS are coming from two different directions. Some of them are running some flavor of Kubernetes on top of existing virtual servers or EC2 instances using some form of tooling. There's one called KOps that allows you to manage a Kubernetes cluster, but it can be complex. There's a lot more work involved for the DevOps team or the operations team to manage both the control plane and all of the worker nodes. You have to manually control things like scaling as you go in and out. And it just becomes more complicated as they develop these more complex applications and as more and more teams start using them. From the other direction, I see customers that are new to containers in general, and they see the direction that the community is going in, that Adam talked about. Kubernetes is certainly seems to be the orchestration layer of choice. So both of these groups of customers tend to look for a solution that makes it easy for them to adopt. Those ones who are already familiar with Kubernetes as a concept, they struggle with the amount of time they're spending managing the overall Kubernetes environment that Amazon really takes over as part of the EKS service. They make the control plane much easier. They let you do auto scaling, so you don't have to worry about that. And those customers that are new to containers in general, they want to go with what they believe will be the future-proof choice. So for them, it makes a lot of sense to go with a more managed service and a place to jump right in. In the world of Amazon, EKS ties in very easily with a lot of the other Amazon services. So if you're familiar with AWS in general, you can easily plug right into the ecosystem and start consuming and spread across the Amazon world easily.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I assume a lot of Amazon customers are choosing EKS based off of that integration. On the Google side, Will, how about you? What do you see as it relates to GKE and why customers are choosing that platform?
As you mentioned earlier, and as Adam alluded to earlier, Google's really been the first one to the market with their containerized solution for Kubernetes. They developed Kubernetes. So being the first one there has really driven the adoption rate, at least on our side. And I think we chose to go GCP first with our Kubernetes approach on GCP, which makes sense. Also, a lot of the adoption there is centered around being able to pair an application that they're developing against the tools that GCP provides for analytics and machine learning. So they've been producing some very quality tools that developers and data scientists can utilize against large data sets and easily scale to the size they need to be able to run those types of workloads and gain some meaningful insights out of the information that they're gathering from the applications that they're deploying.
Excellent.
I would also say, just to add, Matt, I think that it's really interesting to look at how the different platform providers have approached offering Kubernetes. Each one of the distributions you mentioned has their own set of strengths and weaknesses. And really, it is very, very interesting to watch how they continue to evolve. One of the big challenges that Amazon had to look at differently was how to authenticate to the Kubernetes cluster. So EKS had a bit of a different authentication system for some period of time. And I know that they're also working to build in very deep integration to things that do things like present Amazon credentials to individual containers. Having all of the different platform providers really building into Kubernetes is one of those other things that I think really pushes it over that sort of quorum of interest, because it allows each of the platforms to integrate it in the ways that make sense for their consumers. So Will talked about GKE, and the experience for deploying GKE is certainly the most mature out of the three providers. It's certainly been in the market the longest, and they really did a great job of making it very easy to deploy and tear down ephemeral clusters, because in many ways, that's how several folks in the Kubernetes ecosystem see the world, that these clusters are sort of created and destroyed all the time, and you may build an entirely new Kubernetes cluster to run an instance of your application. So each provider's taken sort of their own interesting approach that I think has, each approach has its own trade-offs in terms of pros and cons. So it's been exciting to watch how they've all developed slightly differently, but all along the same themes.
When you think about some of those considerations, Adam, for somebody who's walking into Kubernetes as a new consumer, a new user, how do you guide them on the path to take in regards to the platform?
It sounds overly simplistic, but I think for many people, it really boils down to what set of services do you want to use with your applications. A lot of our customers are actually running Kubernetes in more than one cloud platform, because what they want to do is they want to build some microservices that might rely on a set of Amazon products, or may rely on DynamoDB or Aurora or some technology that's a bit distinct in the Amazon world. And others might have a set of technologies they want to use some of the Google machine learning offerings around, and that's what they are intending to do. And we've actually started to see customers in healthcare that have Kubernetes clusters running across multiple cloud platforms, and they're choosing where their workloads live based on the set of PaaS services they want to have presented to those applications effectively.
So, thinking about now how to apply this into healthcare, I think is probably critical for our audience today. Conor, you were talking a little bit before the call around some potential use cases that you've seen healthcare organizations, really adopt, and what is driving them towards Kubernetes. Would you mind walking us through one of those?
Yeah, we've been talking to a customer who's building an application to process oncology images, and part of that, it's an application they're building from the ground up. So they were able to start fresh and think about it from a different perspective. So what they did is they built out an image processing set of services. And right from the beginning, they realized that they should be looking at Kubernetes because of that dependency architecture that Adam talked about a few minutes ago. It allowed them to very easily create a set of microservices that would process the image and then perform some of the analysis that they want. And by creating it in Kubernetes, they were able to very quickly bring that online and build that processing pipeline. So not only could they bring it online, but it also allows them to scale properly. So if they had done it in a traditional manner, they may have had to have one individual server for each of these steps along the way, or they would have combined steps onto one server, creating points of failure. By creating it in a container model, they can be more resilient as the processing occurs, and they can also be more efficient, where they need actually less resources and less spend to perform the same level of work. But it allows that image processing to be quickly consumed from when the image is taken through to the application, so that radiologists can actually view the image quicker.
What are some of the KPIs, or how are they really measuring success of the platform?
They've built the platform from the ground up with Kubernetes, primarily based on familiarity of the system, but knowing that it was easy for them to build in the Kubernetes ecosystem with that dependency and very simplistic way of expressing the pieces that they want. Typically, when I've talked to healthcare organizations that measure, let's say, eyes on images as a KPI, they tend to do it with their customers or doctors or nurses. In the world of healthcare, those are some of the most picky users, and they tend to be very negative against things that take a long time, because they are moving from patient to patient and they're trying to perform quick diagnostics. So they don't like to wait 10 seconds for an image to load. They want to be able to see that image. I believe the time they were looking to do was under 2 seconds for the image to load for the doctor to review it.
Wow, that's helpful. Yeah, the reason I asked that is, a lot of our conversations on this podcast are around how to measure utilizing more cutting edge technology to show actual benefit in healthcare. And certainly it would save money if we're seeing increased response time or reduced load time. Will, you mentioned early on that GKE was kind of the platform that ClearDATA led with. Do you have any customer use cases out there that you wanted to speak to that, may complement Conor's?
Sure. One client in particular really looked to Kubernetes to solve that use case that I sort of alluded to earlier, in that they wanted to develop an application that gathered patient health information, and then they were able to run machine learning and analytics against those workloads. And they also wanted to bring some of their on-prem data into that sort of machine learning and analytic workloads. So they're running Kubernetes on not only GKE, but inside of their own data center as well. So they have some legacy applications running in their data center. So they're running some Kubernetes clusters on that data center to sort of transform that information and then get it back out into GCP to run their different experiments on that.
We've talked a lot about the history and the practical application of Kubernetes. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the architecture. Adam, would you mind kind of walking through and teaching our audience around best practices on how to deploy, the master control plane and how to really manage Kubernetes on the back end?
I would say that when we look at large distributed systems, and when we look at system design in general over the last few years, it's really become an emerging pattern where a lot of emphasis, rightfully so, to build reliable systems is placed on separating the control plane from the workload or the data plane. Kubernetes certainly follows that sort of a pattern where there's a concept of deploying a set of Kubernetes masters that run a set of processes that are required for the health of the overall container cluster itself. But those processes in the masters are not necessarily interacting with the workload that's running on the cluster. Rather, they're strictly responsible for scheduling, monitoring health, providing service discovery, providing services under the covers to these running applications. When we look at best practices, each of the different clouds has their own method of deploying this control plane. Google and Amazon and Azure all do it slightly differently. But at the end of the day, the idea being that ultimately the provider, in this case, the cloud services provider, can be very responsible for the version management, the protection, the upgrading, the monitoring of these control planes so that people that want to run on top of these platforms don't have to think about that component of operating their application as much. They can focus on making sure they're building their applications in the appropriate way. And when we really look at some of the other major Kubernetes distributions, right, another one that we haven't mentioned yet is Pivotal's container service, or Pivotal's Kubernetes service, perhaps. That platform also has this idea of deploying the management control plane and then much more flexibly allowing customers to control the size and number of the workload nodes that are actually running. So Conor alluded to it earlier, but many of these mature distributions are advocating for automated scaling of this workload layer as best practice. So the second class of machines where the workloads run are really where you have the ability to do things like run agents that are necessary for security and compliance, to look at the individual container workloads, and if you want to add something like a service mesh routing layer like Istio, integrate those in. Now, in many cases, the control plane's involved and can orchestrate these changes through primitives like daemon sets and custom resource definitions, but the actual execution of these services occurs on the second class of worker node. So that's really, I guess, at a high level how the architecture works now. Many people that go into this are also making other related architectural decisions. So other patterns we've seen emerge here, things like the service mesh pattern. I mentioned Istio briefly, but many folks are looking at how do they securely route traffic and provide service discovery for applications that are being deployed rapidly and often, and where you have many hundreds of microservices that might ultimately make up one customer-facing application. Another part of where I see a lot of folks in healthcare talking about Kubernetes is around that ability for their business to focus on what many of them term as cloud transformation, but really application transformation, to leverage all the great power they've heard about in the cloud and really realize the benefits there. And the Kubernetes architecture, because of the separation of responsibilities I was describing, really provides that ability for them to focus more on the workloads that they're building and the workload environments, and less on the actual moving parts that are required for Kubernetes to function appropriately in the master control plane area.
That's very helpful, and certainly a hot topic is, as these healthcare organizations adopt public cloud services, how can they do so without having to really be deep in them so they can focus on their apps? That's great to know. And as always, wanted to remind everyone that if you're just tuning in, Matt Ferrari of CTO Talk, we're getting to talk to Conor Colgan, our product manager from AWS at ClearDATA, Will Carlson, the product manager for Google Cloud Platform, and Adam Greenfield, our VP of Architecture. And we're really focusing on Kubernetes in healthcare today. We've now spoken really on background and platform and history and architecture, but folks always ask about, what's coming or where are things going. Conor, what do you see, as you look into the future of Kubernetes adoption, whether it's the technology or whether it's healthcare? What do you see from the platform moving into the future?
I hear a lot about integration in multi-cloud, so running Kubernetes in one cloud and connecting it to other clouds and being able to move workloads across clouds as you need them. So Adam and Will both mentioned that as pieces they're talking about. And if I look at some of the features and discussions that came away from some of the come across in the last year about Kubernetes, that's a hot topic, is how can they get it to make it easier for things to talk about. The other places that I see more about in the healthcare space, Adam mentioned it briefly about getting some visibility into the appropriate layers so you can see the data that comes through. You can understand where your data is, especially if it's sensitive or PHI data as it flows through your applications. You want to be able to understand where your data is flowing. We talk to security compliance officers all the time, and oftentimes they want a data flow diagram. It's the most popular ask that we get. And if you are able to create some sort of tracing that can detect that sensitive information as it flows through these more and more complex workloads, you can help those privacy officers feel more comfortable with these cloud adoptions and these new ecosystems that they're getting involved with. And I think that's important for healthcare, because you can have developers really getting interested in something in Kubernetes, but if the security and compliance needs aren't there, it becomes a much bigger challenge for actual adoption.
I would say the other area that I'm super excited about is thinking about what's next, right? Kubernetes has now gotten to the point where I feel like it's certainly gotten critical mass, but there's a lot of exciting developments in the space right now. When you look at the Knative ecosystem that was announced at Next, even Project Rift from Pivotal, the ability for more and more of the concerns of operating the platform to be taken over by software. Ironically, looking at my career history, I'm kind of excited about automating myself out of a job, right? I've been building infrastructure for 15 years, and in many ways, I see this as a very exciting way for us to automate many of the day-to-day concerns of managing infrastructure. And there's always going to need to be people involved in building and managing that, and in making sure you have the right automation components in place, to what Conor was talking about. But the idea that at the end of the day, developers really get this experience that allows them to build even more exciting things on top of it. I've been an infrastructure geek for a long time, and the things that are more exciting is, to the use cases that Conor and Will both mentioned. Things like that weren't necessarily possible in the past. So I'm excited to see what people build on top of it. And I'm very excited within the ecosystem to see how that waterline continues to raise as people allow more and more of the infrastructure to be managed by automation, so developers can focus on really adding core business value.
Yeah, to echo that, all the customers and prospects that I've talked to so far really seem to emphasize that they want to be as serverless as possible, and they see Kubernetes as a path forward in that initiative.
As we're thinking about that, Adam mentioned it, especially in healthcare, there are a lot of folks that have been managing, deploying, maintaining infrastructure for years and years. Will, just as a follow-up to you, how would you go about best educating folks that have been these server huggers, if you will, including myself? How do we educate them on that Kubernetes is the path forward, and that there's better use for their time?
Sure. There seems to be a lot of fear in moving to new technology, in healthcare into the cloud in general. So reducing the amount of fear requires knowledge, right? So being able to educate people on how these technologies work is really paramount, but also helping others understand what it takes to be secure and compliant inside of those different environments, and really how easy it could be to be able to do that in a system where you can control a control plane across clouds using one service. I think that's a really powerful message that we could probably form.
For actually each of you guys to take part in this one, we haven't spoken about ClearDATA at all, because we wanted to focus really on Kubernetes today. But I'd love to hear from each of you. How does how does ClearDATA themselves look to leverage Kubernetes, whether it be a product offering or even internally, right? There's lots of folks that are going to be listening to this podcast that aren't necessarily, at the provider level or the payer level. Maybe they're a SaaS company or a healthcare medical device company. So how does ClearDATA, look to leverage Kubernetes? Conor, why don't we start with you?
I kind of touched on it a minute ago, but one of the things ClearDATA is looking at, I'll focus on externally for our customers, is to help them with that healthcare aware tracing through a Kubernetes system, so you can detect and trace sensitive data as it flows through those complex microservices. That way, it makes it much easier to build a stronger audit trail, or those data mapping diagrams I talked about. That's one of the things we're focused on from customers, because that's a challenge for them today.
Excellent. And Will, how about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So the first question internally, our development team actually developed a serverless Forseti using containers in Kubernetes. So Forseti is a tool that can gather asset information inside of GCP and apply policy against that asset inventory. We use it internally to gather asset information for our compliance dashboard and our automated safeguards. And our development team managed to create a version of that was installed in Kubernetes that could scale quickly to the scale it needed for new customer workloads, and then reduce its size to save on costs. So we didn't have to have traditional infrastructure running all of the time. That got our partner Google so excited that they even co-authored a blog post with us on that development, which I thought was pretty neat.
As you would imagine, we've been building in containers now at ClearDATA for some time. I am most excited when we start to look at a lot of the same benefits we've talked about for customers for our own internal teams. We now have teams developing applications across 3 cloud providers internally. The ability for us to leverage something like Kubernetes to standardize more of their experience is something I was talking about with our principal engineering team just a few hours ago. Moving to things like service meshes can offer us the sort of visibility that Conor was describing for our own internal applications, where today we have many ways to deploy workload. We have things that are deployed in App Engine for Google. We have things that are deployed in Lambda from AWS. We have many different services we've deployed differently. So the ability to offer developers a common experience across all 3 of the cloud providers is one of the ways I think we're really excited to leverage it internally.
Excellent. Yeah, so there's no lack of use case internally at ClearDATA. And certainly, even I'm excited about the opportunity for optimization and cost savings as ClearDATA grows and scales. So thank you all for joining today. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. If you have a comment, make sure you check out and follow #CTO Talk, or follow me at Twitter at @MPFerrari. You can always learn more about CTO Talk at HealthcareNOWradio.com or ClearDATA.com. I'm Matt Ferrari. Thank you to Conor, Adam, and Will. And until we have another conversation, have a good week, everyone.